But we can't like sit in front of the screen, so
yeah. Hello. Yeah. It'll be fine. Should I just pause it?
oh no, that's right.
No, because
I took the last one. And so that's okay.
I took 2.
Greedy of you. No, I don't want one. I know I'm fine. I'm really don't need to go.
I think that we should
But apparently
do some like interactive stuff.
oh, really? Yeah. No, I really worked at Zionize. I just know like they went to go, and I don't. Yeah, because I need to. What's gonna happen? They're gonna be. Give me that drink. Yeah. They're gonna take Maggie's.
I don't know.
Maggie eventually becomes the leader. It's because something to do with hair. We should do somebody got mad and they were forced into that. Actually thinking about this.
Do we want to do
Yeah. Start up a new story. And I just know and then they get and like.
Anyway, so I was having to write my chapter until all of a sudden. So they get like.
You think like they'll be able to
Who is it?
Yeah, I think they'll just sing Carl.
Not that I got to Carl.
Oh, okay, so you're not saying, okay, I see. I was envisioning like family bullshit thing, or like they alternate setting people up. But you mean like they make a decision
Because then that way there's elsewhere in here. Do you think that's going to jeopardize it and stress? No, I think that will help.
No, they want to look for the IDs, yeah.
I know. Because you do like a little bit of time. I don't think
I did not get confirmed, which is interesting. And my mother was like, and then left 40 minutes. She didn't know I was coming up. All right, really to deal with. We'll talk.
Yeah, for visitors and because some of them may have. And we could also do leave that.
And I got this one guy who will only call them silence. He will not call them satyrs because it's a difference. Well, well.
I don't know if I don't have questions.
Of course.
We can go through some.
Well, so are
satyrs,
satyrs,
but
satyrs are
I bet a lot of.
But
his wish was like the lead satyr dude.
he is, he's like the old guy.
That's
This
what.
one, she's like,
Because we
she can't
don't want it to
difference,
get
but still has
interactive to the point that they're not getting.
Right, of course.
So this guy's reason for referring to him as silence is because that's how they're inscribed on the Francois base. There's a satyr, but it's called a silent. So he says, well, Ergonomus or Clivius, whoever did that, knew what he was talking about, so he used the word silent. And so it could only refer to the silence.
Maggie's like foundation.
Actually, he got, I don't know, he got his PhD from here, so I don't know.
Word.
He's such a know-it-all.
I've never justified buying like a full melon for myself because it's gonna go bad.
Exactly. Unless you need that melon.
Did you work with her?
I did that with my
I helped. I was her like assistant.
Oh, okay.
So I was sometimes on the phone calls and
Right, Jennifer. No, right.
Kelly.
Okay. I was thinking. I remember that. But she was kind of like in
Yes.
yeah. That, I was okay.
Everybody seems to.
Okay, so I was that person working for CCD.
Up to like whoever's right.
Wasn't it about 8 years ago?
Thank you.
Well, I graduated in 2006, and I was assisting through that summer until the fall. So
Wow. Okay, so
Yeah.
It probably was where I this practice is
yeah, actually maybe because we did again. No, I don't think so.
Oh, I was going to. I was also going to say.
But with this other contract, I wanted to know and to find out whether it should definition. Yeah, we're proud of it. I have another project. This project is that is why activism why these children to continue activism in their years. So, and they're all women.
Did everybody sign in? I think anybody hasn't signed in. If you could just pass it around.
We'll start with Bryn Mawr time, so you have a couple more minutes. Keep going.
Get more food.
Make it worse than five. And we're talking courses.
Yeah, because I do
Esther, so it must be official.
Yeah. The one from the back.
Are you saying no?
No.
So we think that's some of the furniture. We're gonna have yours.
Yeah.
Do you want furniture?
No.
Sure. Okay. All right. Oh. Can we start, or would you like to? Do you have anything else you'd like to add? Welcome and thank you so much for coming today. As most of you know, but my name is Laura Surtees, and I'm a research and instruction librarian here at Bryn College in Carpenter Library. And today, myself and my co-speakers are going to present on the symposium that we all attended at Duke University called Apps, Maps, and Models. It was a symposium on digital pedagogy and research in art history, archaeology, and visual studies as part of the Wired lab at Duke University. So,
Sure. I'm Rachel Starry in the archaeology department. I'm a PhD candidate.
Okay, my name is Tom Morton. I'm a visiting assistant professor in the Cities department, and the great, I would say, connection to this is that I'm teaching a course this term called Digital Rome, and with also all these things digital on campus, as I will highlight in the talk as well. You'll hear me say this several times. There's a talk on Thursday. Thursday, everyone. Thursday. Phil Stinson will be speaking at the Ely Room, Wyndham House at 4:30, and his talk is entitled Digs and Drones, Digital Experiments in Documenting Roman Architecture. Okay? So our proposed format for today is that we will give a brief overview of some of the presentations that were there. I mean, there are 10 speakers, and so we will talk about these projects very briefly, highlight, let's say, maybe websites or things like that. I know you'll be going to a YouTube video, correct? And so to talk about some of these projects and some of the larger things that they entail. But again, there were a good 10 presentations. We hope that there's plenty of time for discussion. So in many ways, we're just presenting ideas, planting seeds, and hope for large conversation for the latter part of this talk. Okay? So I would say without further ado, we can possibly start with some of this material. The first part is that at the beginning of the conference, there are a series of talks that looked at, in essence, where are we? Looking at, and for the first speaker, Pamela Fletcher, she spoke about digital art history. Where are we? And she used the image by Gauguin. Where do we come from? What are we? And where are we going? And actually talked about, is it necessarily entrenched, digital humanities? Is it entrenched in schools at this point, in colleges and universities? But doesn't necessarily have the respect that it should have. And it's a very serious, in many ways, it's a very serious issue. That is that scholarship in question because it's, digital scholarship. It's not being treated as seriously. What about digital publications? And she was right there and said, oh, I just worked on the new guidelines, proposal for College Art Association and Society of Architectural Historians. It was just released to say, yes, these are major issues and they need to be taken into consideration. Okay. But also with the digital projects, one of the great positives is that, is this increasing access to our respective fields that, and we can talk about this a little bit later as well, but, we can all think about the condition of the world today. Can we go everywhere to do our research? Of course not. Is the digital the way that we can actually access some of this material, okay, and actually, quote unquote, teach it? Can we actually work on it and continue our research on these topics, okay? She was also, playing off of the titles, like where are we going? One of the things she was quite interested in was to say, in terms of our disciplines, are we now able to ask actually new questions? And this goes to how these digital tools are being used. And throughout the conference, we saw a range of different technologies and things like that, and so we'll try to highlight some of these things. But are they enabling us to ask new questions of the material, and therefore really they have the potential to drive our fields forward? Okay. One of the first projects that we heard about was by a woman by the name of Dorothy Wong, who's at the University of Virginia, and she gave this to die for presentation. You know, Laura was sitting next to me, and we're like, you know, and we're like, you know, it was just like taking all of this notes. That she was very interested in Buddhist art and seeing the transmission of Buddhist art. Okay, that could you, looking very specifically as a specific deity, and I will not pretend to be able to pronounce that, but the Avalokiteshvara across Asia, and so she was able to try to map this, actually going across from the Himalayas into China, Southeast Asia, up into Japan, etc. And by mapping the actual statues, by actually mapping the texts and things like this, and doing this as also to say, here is a way that you could actually get things to get museums actually cooperating with each other, that they would actually gain from actually this participation, that their objects are going to be understood in a much larger context. Okay, and so she, you know, she worked several years with there's a specific center at the University of Virginia on the technology and the humanities, and if you go to their website, and I just put up there the one for the Silk Road, which is her specific project, you know, it enables you to see they were able to do a series of projects. I guess according to the website, maybe close to 20 digital projects they have underway or have been done in the past number of years. And this has enabled them to, specifically with her project, to say, okay, we can bring this all together. But then she said, what can we say of these questions? You know, what are tangible things that we can actually get from this? That we've created this large database. And this is something else we also heard at the talk. So what happens when you've created the massive database, or this or that? And then what can you actually do with it? And for one of the things that they were interested in modeling was to see, well, just how does, let's say, imagery move? Is it necessarily by the objects themselves? And what she was looking at for some of the things, let's say, some of the sculptures from India and seeing similar sculptures in modern-day Japan, she said, we actually don't have evidence of the physical movement of objects, but we do have evidence of the movement of texts that describe the objects. And so you're actually, you would think that it's actually the physical objects that are moving, but she says we don't have evidence of that. And she was able to map all of this. It was a really interesting, shall we say, real world, example of like, oh, this is changing how we would think about it. It's a relational database, and the critical thing to keep in mind is for all of you who might be thinking about creating databases, software changes all the time. Yes, great facial expression. And it is a great point of concern, because if you are building this, these things are not going to be done overnight. It's going to often take several years to build, to be inputting things. Are you building in, the longer history for your database, okay? Or is it in a way that the data you can migrate the data to something else? Dorothy commented that she gave a presentation on the material, and a gentleman came up to her and says, "I have the best software for you to use," and she was like, "No." She's like, "Great, but no. This is what we're using right now, and we're going to go forward with that material." One of the parts of the conference was also focused on visualizations, as you might imagine, with issues of digital pedagogy. And one of the first speakers was Phil Stinson, who will be joining us this week.
Thursday, was it on
yes,
Thursday?
Here we are.
Ely
Room. But his center was looking at, documenting Roman architecture and using photogrammetry. And what are, again, these new tools? that we can use. And, excuse me, with Phil's talk, he was, using material from the sites of Sardis and Aphrodisias, which are in modern day Turkey. Okay, here's a view of Aphrodisias. There's a lot preserved there. Okay, an incredible amount. And so when one is thinking about the use of digital tools, often we think about when we use, let's say, digital reconstructions, are they helping us with sites where maybe there isn't a lot of material there? Well, for Phil, it's the exact opposite problem. He has all of this stuff. Now, how do the digital tools really help? And, is it a way for us to think differently about the Agora space? And this is that Agora space with the image in front of us is a point cloud. What appear to be kites in the sky, those are the locations of drones. Okay, and the blue is actually the places for photographs. And so it's stitching together all those photographs to actually create the point cloud image of the site. This works incredibly well for archaeological projects. I mean, Peter Ricky does it with his work. But it enables you to get an incredible understanding of your site. Phil will also talk about this. They actually had a company based in Berlin actually approached them about doing the project, about doing the aerial photography, and I'm just like, how lucky can they get? A team just wanted to come and do it for them. But then the other thing is like, okay, so now you're getting this. Are you also creating, let's say, an open access version of this? Are you only creating these things and is this almost in the hands of the archaeologists? Are you also presenting this stuff for a general public that you can have an open access version? Okay. For Phil, he was also very interested in thinking about how some of this stuff is going to go not just, let's say, for the archaeological site, but also thinking very much about museums. Many of you have traveled to archaeological sites and been to museums at those sites. Objects are taken out of context. And so how can you actually better portray those display those objects, and what is the better context that you can offer? And he'll actually be talking about that in greater detail for us on Thursday. I don't want to spend much time on Phil's presentation because, well, he'll be here. Okay? On Thursday. We also heard from Michael Davis, who is a medieval architecture historian, works primarily in France, and he used a program called SketchUp, which is what I use when I teach the digital realm course. It's a very accessible software that, in essence, that students can learn during the course of the semester and actually create, good models and answer good research questions throughout the course of the semester. And for him, he taught a course basically entitled Digital Paris, but says that let's move beyond Notre Dame, let's move beyond Sainte-Chapelle, these great high monuments of medieval French architecture, and look at other things and say, how do they fill out the story? Do we possibly give us a better understanding of these, let's say, of the city of Paris? And so he was basically started working on this Franciscan convent and College of Navarre, and wanted to see also, if we're looking at these things which are also receiving or elements of elite patronage, will their architecture be the same or very, very different? And so here is just one of the digital models that they created of the convent and college. And this is all done within a student seminar. And the great thing about doing something in SketchUp is you actually obviously have to build the thing. When you see something in plan, I never realized when I was actually initially my first year as an archaeology student, just how much you can hide, your lack of knowledge when you do draw a plan. When you try to build something, I mean, it's just, it's all on for display. And so he said, for this convent, we have absolutely no idea how it's roofed, but then if so, it's a building, we have to put a roof on it. How do we actually go about doing this, and what are the reasons for doing it in this manner? And he said very specifically, and this is all very tree vaulting back along here. But you have to figure it out. What is the actual evidence? Do we have evidence for this even though we have never seen models of this convent and college is no longer standing? How can we put forward a reasonable hypothesis? Okay. And for him, again, it gets back to the larger question. Do these projects change our understanding of medieval Paris? And for him, he said, yes, they are. Yes, they do change. Because thinking very specifically about scale, materials, choir screen, etc., it changes. It changes things. This is clear as day, very different than what you have for Notre Dame, clear as day, very different than what you have for Saint-Tropez. And yet it's also the same elite patronage. Okay? And so for him, it's much more filling out the story. I'm moving along these very quickly to make sure my co-speakers have a chance to speak. Another form of visualization was also quite interesting, was by Donald Cooper. And his book was entitled Modeling Architecture and Uncertainty in Renaissance Florence. And this was a really interesting thing. He was approached by a museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, to see if he could create a digital reconstruction of Santa Chiara and San Pier Maggiore in Florence. Why? Because the Victoria and Albert Museum have works from these places, and they were going to basically be reinstalling their galleries and have a special exhibition. And so they applied for funding, and this is one of the interesting things we can talk about later in terms of funding, is that in the UK, for some of these projects that you'll hear about, they were able to get public funding, but it also meant that there had to be a public component, excuse me, a public component of the project, that it had to, in many ways, be on public display. And they got, Donald was saying they got the project, I think it was like late April, and it had to be up on display by November. That's a very, very short calendar. If any of you have worked in museums, that's super fast. Museums don't work that fast. Trying to do digital reconstructions, no. And so this forced them to actually address a lot of things. Like, how do you actually present material? Well, of course, you have to go to Florence and say, well, here's the piazza now. Yes, we don't see a church there, We're missing things. Oh, yes, things to be repurposed right now. And if we go to the Victoria and Albert, yes, this is how they've reconstructed the chapel and tried to position the things inside as they were once within the initial chapel. But for them, I had on the opening screen for Cooper's presentation is the notion of a point cloud. That it's not, you're not drawing with solid lines, you're not like blocking in things. With a point cloud, it's suggestive yet fuzzy. It is conveying the idea, but it's not shall we say, conveying certainty. Okay? And then that's the other part of this title, by acknowledging uncertainty. And I can tell you, as instructor, the very first time I taught my digital Rome course, I was at Arizona State, I had a student wonderfully ask, how do you draw maybe? And it's a brilliant question. It really is. And then how do you convey the notion of maybe-ness such that anybody viewing it will actually understand it? And I would say for a lot of these projects, they're available on the web, without text. And so how can, let's say, images where there isn't a supporting text, how can they explain, let's say, their levels of knowledge? What is known, what is unknown, what is hypothetical? Okay? And with this project by Donald Cooper, very clearly, they stepped back. They said, we're going to use a point cloud because it is not showing all the detail. Okay? Very intentional. Not to push and create all the bells and whistles, but to step back to make sure it's clear that that level of uncertainty is still in the project. It's still in the final project. Okay? And turn it over to you.
So, three of the projects that I'm going to present have all in common a focus on GIS and digital mapping. So the first one is World Map, which is a Harvard project. It's an open source mapping platform that's being developed by the Center for Geographic Analysis at Harvard. And one of their goals is to lower barriers for scholars who wish to explore, visualize, edit, collaborate with, and publish geospatial information. This project is being spearheaded by Suzanne Preston-Bouillet, who's a historian of African art and architecture at Harvard. And among the things that you can do with World Map, and I actually, as soon as the conference was over, I ran home and created an account and logged in and started playing around with it because it was such an exciting project. So I actually am kind of using it for my dissertation work on Roman militia and taking scanned paper maps, georeferencing them, and then overlaying them on satellite imagery of the sites that I'm working on. So you can upload your own GIS data sets. You can choose from thousands of other layers to overlay them with. You can create, like I did, and share new maps. As I said, georeference scanned paper maps using their warp tool, so it's not only useful for foreign digital data, but also for anything you want to import. And you can export anything that you create using standard formats like GeoTIFF and Shapefile. World Map's also compatible with Google Maps and ArcGIS, which you might be more familiar with. But it's online and free, so you don't have to pay for anything. You can just create a free account and save your own maps on their servers. And you can also customize the collaboration, so you can say, I want this person to be able to edit, and you can share it to a select group of people or publish it kind of privately. So some of the other projects that World Map has been used for, Africa Map was actually the first project that then expanded into World Map, and this is what Suzanne Preston-Bouillet works on. Africa Map has a huge number of overlays for things like population densities, religious, ethnic, occupational groups, historical maps, and all kinds of other things. Tweet Map is a recent project by a Harvard student who actually harvested georeference data from Twitter, and you can query it for any time frame, place, for example here in Manhattan, or phrase, which is fantastic. Kind of more traditional uses would be for something like demographic studies. This is just a shot of Chicago poverty rates in the year 2000. Another interesting project is World Fair maps. So this is the Philadelphia Expo of 1876 overlaid onto a modern Google map, showing how, studying how world fairs actually impacted and changed the cityscapes of the cities that they were held in. So all kinds of interesting things. And her main point for her own research on Africa was that digital mapping can reveal and suggest new connections between topography and society. And she made all kinds of really interesting conclusions that I didn't quite understand because I wasn't thinking about African studies, about things like demographic distribution of occupants in cities, political control of landscape, and there's potentially limitless uses for different fields of study. And I think especially relevant for the grad group and cities departments here. So that's the first project. Moving on to the second. So Fabrizio Nevella is a professor and chair of art history and visual culture at the University of Exeter in the UK. He developed this immersive smartphone and tablet app that attempts to locate, experience in a Renaissance city in real time. The app takes you on a unique tour of the Renaissance city of Florence through the eyes of a contemporary guide, a 1490s school worker named Giovanni. So as you walk around the city, Giovanni introduces you to things and takes you on a tour. And actually, we can look at a quick 30-second video. I should pull it up.
So is that like a walking tour?
It is, exactly. Actually, I think I need the keyboard to go back to the PowerPoint. Sorry. Now I need a mouse. Technology. Okay. So, as you saw GPS markers trigger audio so that when you arrive at a landmark, Giovanni begins to tell you about it. And it's not the kind of app where you have to sit and read text on the screen. It actually only uses visuals to clue you into things that are in front of you, so you actually spend your time listening and then looking at the things in the city of Florence. And this is just one of the walking tours that is available on the app. There's many other projects similar to this that use the historical maps and overlay them on modern street plans. But this app goes a little bit further in using real-time geolocation data from smartphones to map your movement and allow users to unlock content with your movement through the city. So it was very interesting. So the third project that I'll talk about briefly is a project that Paul Jascott of DePaul University has been working on at the National Gallery of Art, which is on a 2-year fellowship. His project was called Historical Journals as Digital Sources, Mapping Architecture in Germany 1914 to 1924. And his main research question was, how can we theorize about a topic as large as the construction industry, more specifically the construction industry in the interwar period in Germany. So his goal was to create a database with a large data set drawn from the architectural journals that are published between 1914 and 1924. And the data is mined from any mention of construction activity in these historical journals. And then he wants to use that data to visualize the construction activity. So he wants to know when things were built, what was built, and where. And then from this, he produced digital maps illustrating patterns in construction activity and then changes across time in Germany. And it's not published yet, so I don't have any maps to show you. But this is just an example of one of the kinds of buildings he's looking at, the Einstein Turm in Potsdam. And he essentially concluded that historical mapping can bring order to what might otherwise seem like cultural chaos. So in Germany, things are being built all over without any indication of patterns besides obvious ones like Berlin as a center hub. But through the database, he was able to draw out more nuanced picture of this construction activity, essentially. He also argued that digital mapping can lead to more precise granular analysis and actually illuminate new areas of research. So building activity that wasn't the focus of major historical narratives and didn't actually show up as much in the historical journals. So it's kind of the dark matter that he wants to explore in the next project.
So the final kind of 3 talks that I'm going to talk about today that came at the end of the symposium as well sort of center around museums, but also primarily about accessibility of art and collaboration on an interdisciplinary, interdepartmental, and interinstitutional scale. So it's looking at different ways of collaboration and allowing for more accessibility, all wrapped around this whole notion of open access and open source information. The first one, which is where mathematicians get involved in art history, by Ingrid. She was really interesting because she's a math professor who started to collaborate with the North Carolina Museum of Art in looking at how we analyze art, and specifically more looking at not art on the superficial or the surface level, but when you start to look at the nitty-gritty of art through X-ray analysis. And one of the things that they did was they created this platypus project, which again is an open source software that you can download. It's limited support, but at the same time they're really open for anybody to use it. Basically, in the 12th to 17th century, much of the art in Europe was painted on wooden boards. And when, as part of the conservation and the preservation of these artworks, a cradle is attached to it to support the artwork. But what happens when you take an X-ray image of the painting, one of the things you get is the cradle. And so you get lots of places in the artwork where you can't see the cracks or the different texturing. And so one of the things people use this for is to understand how the painting is actually manufactured. and the intricacies of it, also sometimes when there's overlay of paintings and things like this. But the square, the grid, is really annoying. And so basically, they team together between an electronics and informatics department in Brussels, the mathematicians in Duke, and the North Carolina Museum. They created algorithms to basically determine what is the texture of the painting versus what is the texture of the cradle. And they're actually able to remove the cradle visually to bring out the whole painting. Now granted, yes, you can kind of see it faintly, but it actually opens up the painting dramatically so, and so you get a lot more understanding. The PhD student who first started working on this was looking at the cracks in the paint. And with the cradle there, you can't see that. But without, you can see it much more clearly. And so one of the things this does is it opens up sort of cross-collaboration between different groups and using different expertise to sort of come at a bigger, larger question. And using tools that are not, I don't know how to do algorithms, never going to. It's just not part of it. But at the same time, by collaborating with people, there is actually ways to make these projects and this software available. And as I said, it's completely available. You can download it and do it yourself. The second project, and I'm going to turn more towards the museum world for the next couple projects that I talk about. The first project was by the Cleveland Museum of Art, or by C. Griffin's Man, who originally started at the Cleveland Museum of Art and is now at the Metropolitan Museum. So he kind of talked about two major projects associated with his work. The idea is basically to create a more user-friendly environment, to get art more accessible, more people interested in it, make it interactive, more engaging, so it's not walking around a very silent place, staring at things, not knowing what you're talking about or looking at, and the like. To make it sort of more approachable, really, is what it comes down to. And just like we saw with the app of Florence, or lots of museums now have audio tours that you can get down on your phone and you walk around. One of the things that the museum, the Cleveland Museum, in this massive $350 million project to revitalize the museum, they start using technology, not just your cell phones, but iPads and the like, and they've created different projects. Gallery 1 is this great space in which it's a combination of great works of art and technology. And we can actually, I can use technology. Oh. No? Oh, it is. Yes. How do I have to? This is the first time I've ever put a link in. Okay. Well, it's here. Maybe if I close it out, it's down on the computer as well. Can you use the bottom? I don't have the mouse. We really should just keep everything together. But it's just a quick little clip. Where's mine? All these buttons. So Gallery 1 is this one big space sort of that all these spaces feed into. And they have a series of different touch pads, as well as this massive wall in which it houses all the 4,000 pieces in the collection that you can customize your own experience at the museum itself. You can play with it, you use your body, you use your mind, you use your devices in this really sort of interesting kind of way. So, as you see, it's this collection wall where you can swipe and you pull up all these. Oh, I didn't even actually think of that. Okay. So the collection wall is these different sort of, basically thumbnails that you can pull up, whatever, and you can customize your tour. If you're interested in Greek art, you pull up all the things. It's a way for you to search and explore the gallery so that you can make your own personalized tour, because it's basically creating a playlist of objects that you can download to your phone, to an iPad, that you can then walk your way through the museum. And it actually will point you in the directions you need to go. So it means that you don't actually have to go through a museum the way the museum curators want you to. You can actually create your own experience. There's lots of different places where you can put your face and it actually tracks your face onto an ancient bust, but your face. You see these people doing different poses as well. It's all part of this sort of engagement and activities. And this is, the Art Lens is an app that you can download to then gather this material. They have iPads at the museum that you can use to walk around. The panels in the museum, as you all know, are limited in what they tell you. So this is a way to actually elaborate on the information available and allows you to pick what information you want to learn about. If you're only interested in the history of it, you can do that, but you can also learn about the techniques or other elements. So it allows for a lot more personalized choice in the museum experience. The last paper was the Lives of Things, which is a digital exhibition at the National Museum of Art, which is where the conference or symposium was held at Duke University. And this is a project, it's actually been a class that they have used to create this exhibition. And again, it's the Department of Electronics and Computing, Art History, and the National Museum. So again, lots of different voices part of this. And basically, there were these statues, these apostles from the 12th century, that are stuck up on a wall that kind of blend into the space, but the idea was to contextualize it a little bit, to make it so that somebody would actually stop and look at them. Because people would just pass by and nobody would ever notice these apostles. And so what they decided to do was they decided to put color into them. These statues actually, or these reliefs actually have pigments or traces of pigment on them. So they basically created a project where on a laptop or an iPad, everything's an iPad, on an iPad in front of the exhibition, you get to pick the different sculpture that you want to color. And when you choose the colors, it actually pops up with information about what the dyes and the pigments are. So it's part of a kind of contextualization, not only of the images where they would have been much more colorful and lively, and to get a better sense of what they would have been like in these cathedrals and churches, but to also understand where the colors and the pigments are coming to make these. It's actually super fun. You can make their face green. We had a great time. But it actually allows for a lot more engagement as well. And perhaps somebody would like to do it at home. we can do the metapes in the atrium. It's a fun little project. But I guess one of the things that's so important about it is because it's not just about making a sort of gimmick. There's data behind it. And I think this is one of the things that's really important about anything that's digital. It still has to be good data for it to be a good digital project. And just because it looks pretty doesn't mean that it's perfect. It has to have some substance to it. And that's why you still have to go to the library. It's not just my plug for the libraries. But it's why it's still important to go back and do that research and to get people to understand the information that goes into it. We have that block, therefore you can build a wall there. You can put blue on here because we have those pigment colors, things like that. So a lot of it is about accessibility and making it more engaging and interactive for the public. This is huge amounts of money that went into these projects. So not everyone can do it, probably not carpenter. But at the same time, that's an issue of who's able to do this. Because so much money has to go into some of these digital projects, it's an issue of accessibility of digital tools and what is possible. So I think one of the things, those were sort of the highlights of the different presentations that we saw, and these are some of the sort of talking points or sort of discussion points or themes that kind of came out that we think are relevant to Bryn Mawr and to the discussion as a whole. So if anybody has any questions right off the bat, or we can discuss any of these sort of points as well.
Well, I'm actually curious about the very first one. What would be the potential dangers?
Well, I think one of the things that really came up, and I think we touched on it in a few places, was the idea of ambiguity. So it's dangerous, and as Laura said, you can kind of oversimplify what you're presenting, and you have to show that there's really research behind it. So a lot of the projects where they kind of highlight, and actually in the database project that I talked about, he had an ambiguity field in his database that said, we are not sure about this. We know that this building is mentioned, that they're planning it. We don't actually know if it was actually built, so it's ambiguous. So if you can kind of incorporate that into your projects and understand that there is ambiguity and we're not working with complete data, especially in archaeology. It's very incomplete, so you have to highlight that and make sure that comes across when you present the information.
And I would say with the digital reconstructions, let's say specifically of archaeological sites or things like that, the classic example is the Rome Reborn project. I mean, you have this great thing you can fly through and it looks great and everybody's like double thumbs up, and then like, well, what do we know? I mean, how much of that is actually known? And that's not clear at all when you actually view the project. And so potential dangers you're conveying, either intentionally or unintentionally, you're conveying that we know a heck of a lot more than we actually know. And for me, this goes back to what we stated earlier: what is known, what is unknown, what is hypothetical. Are you actually creating that? Are you creating a system within your, let's say, visual representation that's actually showing that? On the simplest level, are you using a wavy line or something like this, as opposed to like a hard edge? You know, to convey almost that notion of it's something is hand drawn, as opposed to computer rendered, to show that maybe we just don't know. Okay.
Also, one of the other issues is gimmicks. All these little apps and models and everything, they're great, and they bring in people and everything. And the Met has started doing a lot more online with publications and interactive publications online, and that's great. But the problem is when there's no substance behind it and it's just a gimmick. One of the concerns with Gallery 1 was that there was too much. And in fact, they actually cut 75% of what the technology they wanted to put in to Gallery 1. Yeah, there's so much technology already there, but they cut so much of it because they thought it was too much and that it was basically just being a stunt, basically, just to kind of showcase we've got lots of money and we're going to make everything pretty and fancy and jazzy. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's any substance to it. And that's one of the things that I think people are quite cognizant of, or starting to be, and that's why guidelines and things are like this are being established so we can evaluate these projects.
How have you responded to the interdisciplinary and interdepartmental? Like who's, you're talking about digital humanities, but if it's an urban studies project and demographics, how do you create this kind of equal playing field so that everybody's expertise becomes relevant?
Yeah.
It's a great question.
And it's a balancing act, and I feel like that's going to have to be answered at the institutional level and the departmental level, and it's going to
Or project level.
Exactly, even the project level.
And I would say that I think we all realize we're at a stage where there's just so much data out there, and that not any one person actually can get a grasp of all of it. and that all these projects are going to be so much richer by having multiple people involved, and such that you will be seeing that these will be collaborative projects from the very beginning, and that there will be, let's say, either interdepartmental or interdisciplinary, because then will also enable people to ask, I would say, better questions. Of all the things that we presented, I don't think that there was a single project where it was only done by a single person. I mean, all of these, there was an individual, but they were speaking in many ways on behalf of a team. I mean, they had a whole group of people working with them. And that's the only way that any of these could actually be done. Getting back to this question about, almost access, I think on the simplest level, it's simply about planting the seed that almost anything is possible. That anything is possible, and that you can try to put together the team to answer these great questions.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of drawing on everybody's expertise as best you can. The problem is collaborative work is difficult and not always seen equally in the finished product, and that is something I think as a different disciplines, as academia, or just as general information overall, we have to address is how do we recognize everybody's contribution equally that benefits them professionally and personally.
Right.
And that's, I think, the tricky part, and I think it's starting to be part of the conversation, especially with these guidelines of how you evaluate this for, promotions and things like this. It's part of the conversation, but I think we have to always make sure that it's a known collaborative project, and everybody should have a voice in it, even if it's one person presenting it. Or
it's quite standard in the sciences, but for the humanities, it's kind of a new concept for people working with other people and co-publishing. So as we develop more, cross-disciplinary standards, it will become, I think, easier.
But I think it's actually one of the pitfalls. I think it becomes a pitfall is the difficulties of acknowledgement of this collaboration can be a pitfall of the digital humanities.
I think it may even be one step earlier than that. And I see this locally among the TRICO. We haven't all agreed on what constitutes digital humanities and digital scholarship. And so until we have standards on that abstract level, I think in terms of an individual project with different groups of people working on it, we've already set ourselves up to some level of discord or miscommunication.
Yeah.
So just to the last point, the value of new digital tools, do you think there's a danger in overvaluing digital tools? And one of the things that comes to mind is the Cleveland initiative. I feel like there has to be a balancing act between trying to draw the public in and sort of the curator's idea of what makes a museum or an exhibition. And I could see that being difficult.
If I could quickly, one aspect of your question gets to, first and foremost, what are the research questions? Like if it is a scholarly project, what are the research questions? And that should impact, which technology or aspects of technology you're using. If you're constantly chasing technology, well then are you really following your research questions? And then that is where I would say you have to apply a level of intellectual rigor to say, well, here are the research questions. This is super cool stuff, but it's not really connected to what I'm doing. And so I'm not going to bring this in. Super, super cool, but it's not what I'm interested in. It's not going to help me answer these questions. And Diane Favreau, who is literally this week being, she's becoming a fellow of the Society of Architectural Historians for her legendary work in the digital realm, among other things. But she's very adamant about this, that you can't be chasing the technology, because when you do that, you've lost your project. Anyways.
I also think there's a difference between what the Cleveland Art Museum is doing versus a scholarly academic project, because the goal of the Cleveland Art Museum is to bring people in.
And make money.
And to make money. True. But to bring people in. And there's been a lot of there's been a lot of conversation about whether or not museums should make their collections available online. And lots of museums have started doing this now, and it's become much more common. But the concern has always been, well, if we put it online, then nobody's actually going to come in and see the objects, because we're giving them the pictures online, and we can give them pictures that turn, and they can walk around them almost. Like, what actually has been the case is it seems to have drawn up more attention to get people into the spaces. So it's done the opposite. So it's actually drawn people in more. And that's what, with the Cleveland Museum, one of the things, and I would say the Met as well, with their publications and everything, it's for a different audience as well. And I think that changes because the questions are different. The output is different as well. Again, I think there's a concern of being, too technology based and only like having everybody stand with an iPad instead of actually looking at the object, which is actually one of the things that's neat about the Hidden Florence app, is that it's not reading a whole bunch of text. It's listening to and looking. And you're looking and being in the space and
directs you to a place.
So I think that a lot of it depends, the value of the tools depend on what the purpose of it is as well.
And I think the concerns that museums are having about making things available online, and what one of the strengths that digital humanities actually has is to democratize knowledge and make it more available to people who otherwise don't have access. They can't make it to this museum, but they don't have a local museum they can go to and see these things. So that is, something that is institutions are, entrenched against, and that digital humanities has the potential to open up and make it more democratic.
One of the questions I had that didn't really seem to be addressed, but I know in terms of value, people are starting to question in terms of accessibility with 3D printing when the digital becomes concrete, and what that actually is going to mean for museums who can now duplicate pieces on a much quicker, faster, and easier level, or even individuals being able to do it in the home based on certain things becoming available. And what does that mean for like potential dangers as well as accessibility?
But I think there's a lot of promise to being able to do a 3D model or a 3D reconstruction that you can print out. It allows for, I actually like the idea of having casts in museums that people are never going to be in. Like, if you are in a regional museum in Kansas, you might never actually get, I don't mind. And then, you might never get to Turkey to see these things, but you have a cast or you have a model of it. It's still that, I actually don't see the harm in that. I actually think it opens up the access and allows for people to have knowledge of things that they wouldn't necessarily be able to physically go see. I think it's a question of the tools and the production quality as well of that model or that printed object or whatever. Is that actually true to what is in the other space as well? But I don't know. I think it's about accessibility, and I like the idea that it becomes more open to different communities. It becomes less elite.
But it also raises questions and issues of ownership too. Like, who owns these things? Is Turkey going to be okay with people printing 3D models on their sites? You know what I mean? So it's like, it's very tricky, and I guess in kind of international politics even.
Yeah.
There was that recent issue that I was just discussing with a couple of you, where the bust of Nefertiti was scanned surreptitiously by two Palestinian, doesn't matter where they're from actually, but it was basically a political statement. They said, why should this die in the graveyard of the museums? This belongs to all people. And then they release the file, like anonymous, so that you can download it and 3D print the Nefertiti bust anywhere you will go. And so it raises all of these interesting cultural heritage preservation and digital humanities things. But what I kept thinking, and it's probably because I'm an archaeologist, yeah, but I want to see the bust of Nefertiti.
It doesn't
So it actually draws you in. Yeah.
It doesn't devalue the original at all. It's
Right,
just
exactly.
opening it up.
I have a question building off of one of the last things that Laura said is that we keep talking about accessibility and making things available to the public, engaging the public, but the accessibility of funds. Did any of the talks sort of touch on the sort of conflict, double-edged sword, like the fact that you want to make something accessible, but it may cost a boatload of money in order to do that, and like how to sort of juggle those two, if that makes sense?
I would say a couple things. Number one, I think I highlighted this with Donald Cooper's project, is that depending upon some of the funding sources, they are explicit that there has to be a publicly accessible component of the project. Okay, and that was a really interesting thing to hear. And I think there was also the Florence app was also worked along that model as well. But then I would also say is it also varies tremendously upon the actual research tool. When I showed the images of the SketchUp model to actually say, can we use the SketchUp to model these two churches in medieval France, and will it change us how we think about medieval France? Well, SketchUp is free for students. Okay, it's a free software, and I think the college had to pay $15 per computer for the digital lab in Carpenter. Okay, that's a steal. Yeah, and then they say, can we rewrite the history of medieval France? And you're like medieval Paris, and you're like wow, for $15. Yes, do this. And so for me, it is yes, there are some things which cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and or even more, and that's just a reality. But there are certainly plenty of other pieces of software, other platforms, etc., where you can do it for a much cheaper way and still get amazing results.
And that's a really interesting thing. Everybody was talking about so much of this being open access material. Like World Map is completely open access, and you can upload everything, and everybody then has your data. So it's just building and building and building a greater database of information on which people can map and use. The Platypus software, anybody, not that everybody has 17th century paintings that they're decradling, but at the same time it's accessible, and any museum can just download this software and use it. So much of this software is actually accessible, and that I think is an important element, is that as we move forward that these tools are available.
And creating it as open access.
Right off the bat,
and
yeah.
the Platypus
exactly.
was the perfect example of that. I mean, we're sitting there and we're also like, this is like awesome, this is so cool, we're seeing it, and many of us have worked in museums, and like we could easily imagine the great applicability of it, and she's like, yeah, we're doing this open access, and you're like, awesome.
I was just kind of curious about how you see the role of the teacher in all of this technology, because I imagine, a teacher bringing a class to a museum, and if each student gets an iPad where they can use this technology, the iPad may be able to deliver information about each painting more efficiently and more quickly to the student than a teacher would. But I don't think anyone would advocate that we don't need teachers anymore. So I was just wondering how you see the balance of, letting the student explore what they want to explore, but also, letting the teacher kind of guide the overall lesson.
I would say that I can answer this. Okay, how honest do you want me to be? I'll be perfectly honest with you. I teach a course called Digital Realm, in which students have to create these, models in SketchUp. Please do not ask me to do anything in SketchUp. I can't. I can put the students in front of this, and I can say, this is what you can do, and this is where I can show you this, and this. I can help you understand Roman architecture and urbanism. Here is an amazing research tool for you to use, for you to further those ideas on these cities. And so it, in many ways, and I've done this at different institutions, which is a whole other literally talk, and so that the Blending Learning Conference, I'll be actually giving that talk. But to be able to say, okay, now you've given the students these opportunities. Like, I taught in an architecture school with these design students. They knew the software inside and out, okay? And I'm like, yeah, and I know Roman architecture in North Africa. Let's meet in the middle, and you guys are going to soar with this material, okay? And so you need, I would say you need that instructor to really be what the pedagogical phrase is, you're not the sage on the stage, you're the guide at the side, okay? And then for this, you are the guide at the side. And then by just guiding them, I mean, anything's possible. I mean, and creating the digital models of these cities, students are looking at questions that have never been addressed in scholarship. Never. And, they don't, on some level they don't know that, and it's so cool to actually see it, okay? But you just guide them by the side. And it would also work, I would say, within museums as well. Just guide by the side.
One of my favorite things that someone said, and I can't remember exactly who, was that stories about things are best told using other things, being apps, maps, models, any of these, new technologies and tools, and I think they can absolutely be used to enhance learning in the classroom in different ways. I can see apps being used to help memorization. Students can literally take their textbook, with them in terms of like an app to help them memorize things on the go wherever they are. Debates can continue outside the classroom and online forums and blog posts and things like that. You could use all different kinds of social media in the classroom, live tweet a lecture, or help them interact and make it more applicable to their everyday lives and ways that they understand interacting with the world a little more closely.
We should probably wrap it up. We could keep you here all night, but it was a really fantastic symposium. But hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the different tools out there that you guys can go home and start playing on World Map and start making apps for whatever city you are working on and the like and everything. But just remember, there's data behind it, so you still have to go to the library. Thank you.
Okay.
I know.
But yes, and speaking about the beginning of my talk has a very funny beginning. Wanted me to teach.
I thought you referred to scholarship as some French German.